I think this is the perfect next step. You can understand that there are, you've probably put together some record trigger flows. You might have dabbled with some auto launch flows, and you're really trying to understand a little bit more about the basics of flows. This is not a FlowFest level competition type presentation. We're not going to go into crazy Apex or anything. This is fairly straightforward. If you have put one or two subflows together, or if you have put a couple of basic flows together and you just want to learn a little bit more, then this is definitely going to be the session for you. So you're going to get a couple of takeaways, right? My goal here is that by the time that we're done today, you're going to be a master of knocking 10 birds with one stone. You're going to know when to use a subflow, and if you grab a tasty beverage like myself, you'll also get a chance to enjoy a tasty beverage. So really quick about myself, just so you guys understand who is this crazy guy that's talking to you guys today. My name's Eric. I'm the Senior Director of CRM over at First Advantage. I am 16x certified. I haven't gone for one in a minute. We actually track how much we saved in our organization. We've saved over 12,000 hours in the past 6 months. I'm crazy passionate about efficiencies. I see my passion is to efficiencies, and I love Salesforce because it's a tool that helps us drive efficiencies. And Flow is definitely one of the key drivers for that. So you can definitely tell that this is something I'm looking forward to, and I'm very honored to get a chance to present at these. I've been a presenter at Florida Dreaming, PAR Dreaming, Automation Hour, Northeast Dreaming, Texas Dreaming, Southeast Dreaming, MAR Dreaming, North Cal Dreaming, many user groups, and probably a couple others that I'm forgetting to mention. But this year, I'm not going to get a chance to go to as many. I will definitely be at Florida Dreaming, I'm sorry. So if you're going to be at Florida Dreaming, I want to talk to you. Feel free to come by, let's chat, let's have a good time. And for those of you that don't know, I am one of the organizers for FlowFest. It is a flow competition. We just went through our FlowFest V5 this week, where the US finally, for the first time, got the FlowFest champion crown. It was a really exciting event. We had head-to-head mode. We got to watch the final 4 competitors building flows right there on the screen. It was an exciting way. We used FlowFest as a fun, educational way to learn more about flows. If you're interested, go ahead and register for the next one at www.flowfest.fans. It helped us tremendously to be able to provide Salesforce and Trailhead, who support us in our events by providing the certification vouchers. We have support in numbers. If you can register for the next one, we would greatly appreciate it. And for those wondering, the QR code will take you to my LinkedIn profile. So if you guys ever want to follow up with me on LinkedIn, feel free to touch base with me later on. I will be more than happy to answer questions. I know several folks always do reach out. So with that said, I want to show this screen to you. And I want to ask you, which one, as an end user experience, which one is a better screen to look at, right? So for those of you that are familiar, basically we have the, for those of you that are familiar, we have the left, which is anytime an error occurs, especially in a screen flow, users will get prompted with this unhandled fault error. And on the right, we have a message that we've created to give them a better, a softer error message. And equally, we get a chance to show that in the message, we add some message and we're able to show saying, hey, something went wrong. We're on this, right? We're taking, we can put a message saying, hey, we're on this, we're aware, right? And you can close this window or try again or whatever it is that you want to do. So for those of you familiar, this is partially a screen flow. You have fault elements in Salesforce, and if any error occurs at any time, you can add a fault path, and I will show an example where you have a fault path here. Here's a simple example, right? If something happens, if there's an issue creating a case, you can put a fault path, and you can put a screen element here. that basically displays the message, right, that you want, and you can do it in several different ways. The challenge is, in a flow, you may have several times that you're updating records or creating records. And what do you do when you want to have that error handling multiple times over? This is where a subflow comes in. This is the power of a subflow. A subflow, in essence, is nothing more than an auto-launched flow, which means, different than a record type flow, you have to go and ask for that flow to do something. A record trigger flow, by the name, means that you're going to do something at the moment, right? Record trigger launches when a record is created. I'll zoom in for those. Launches when a record is created, updated, or deleted. The auto launch flow has no trigger. So you can create that as an auto launch flow or as a screen flow that basically has to be called. The screen flow is very similar, it has to be called. You have to put it in the screen. And a subflow effectively is either a screen flow or an auto launch flow that gets called within a flow. This example that I had, actually, whoops, let's go back. Did we? Give me one sec. Let me find the one. Here we go. So this flow here is effectively an auto launch flow. If I open the flow type, I will show advanced, or this is a screen flow, I'm sorry. But effectively, this is just a screen flow. We use this screen flow, and the name gave it away here. We use this screen flow as a generic error message, as the name implies. What do we do here? Effectively, we display the error message that you guys are seeing the screenshot for. Here is, right, it's all it is just an error message. What this allows me to do, though, is that because I have this flow that launches this error message, I can go at any other flow of my choice, of my choosing, and I can call that again and again. If you've done a flow here, for example, let's just, I'm going to use a sample one that we have had in the past for FlowFest. So if you want to register to FlowFest, there are a lot of things that we do in the back end. We have to get a campaign record, we get campaign members, spectator prizes. You can see all of the pink elements that are either create or updates. So what we do is that we add a fault path for everything, and you can see in every single one of these, instead of having to do this logic, all of these steps, every single time, what I can do is that I can just save all of these steps. Oops, excuse me. I can save all of these steps in a flow of its own, and then I can go and call that. All I have to do, just for example, let's just say that this wasn't here. All I can do is that I can simply go here and say, add an element. I want to add a subflow. And then I pick the flow that I want. And then display error message. Simple as that. And then I'll talk a little bit about some input variables and output variables in a second. But just as simple as that, I went ahead and I'm able to display my error message. And if you're an auto layout fan, and I heard that Freeform is now allowing this as well, you can simply copy and paste your element over as much as you need. And now you're immediately just copying everything over from one to the next. And you're able to accomplish so much faster by these shortcuts. So it's a great tool for repetition. So if you're asking yourself, why Subflows? Subflows is a fantastic tool for repetition. Anytime that you need to do something that utilizes multiple steps, this is a great, or the same steps are utilized multiple times. That is a great use case for using Subflows. One other great example, and I can talk to you about Autolaunched. So for the folks that aren't aware, Ohanaly is a platform that I helped start a couple of years ago that that is meant for to connect freelancers, Salesforce freelancers in specific, with companies that are seeking freelancers. And we have a flow. I can't display it here, but effectively, if you're a freelancer, there's a moment that you're building your profile, and there's a section that you can pick all of the skills that you have, all of your background, saying, hey, my focus is on this, and this cloud. I know how to use this, and this third-party app. I know how to use this Salesforce add-ons. On the customer side, when they're posting a job posting, they are putting in what they need, and we help guide them and say, okay, now tell us the skills that you're looking for. Tell us the add-ons that you have. Tell us the clouds that you're using. And equally, what we try to do at that point, let me get the camera back on now, if it decides to work. Maybe, I don't know. But in any case, my camera apparently just wants to point down. All right, no camera for the sake of technical difficulties. So effectively, we use the same subflow at Ohanaly for the profile builder, for someone to select the skills, and for the customers that are posting the jobs. And they're very complex. Like in those particular cases, here we have a very simple one that's like 3 or 4. The one that I'm talking about is like 30 different elements. There's so much work. And the way that we make subflows useful, right? It's not only about repetition, but to make it useful, what we do with a subflow is that when we're calling it, there's information that we want to send in, and there may be information that we want to take out. If you guys have experience with building flows, one of the key things that you'll have is that you'll probably have been asked to create a variable at some point. And I'm just going to show an example here. I'm going to put text automation hour. So if I select here any value, pretty much, I'm just going to select text. You'll usually get prompted with default value. If it's record, you'll get prompted with the object. But you'll see here availability outside the flow. This section right here is a key section specific to subflows, meaning, is this information, whatever is in this text, whatever is in this text variable that we're about to create, is this information that we're going to be allowed to be inserted when this flow is called? And equally, is this information something that we're going to store within this flow, that once this flow is ready, then we want to go ahead and take out of this flow and pass it back to the original flow that started? Meaning, where are we? Here. So in this particular case, it's an error message. There isn't anything that needs to follow. But if this path continued onwards, if this subflow was called in the main path and this path continued onwards, is there information that's leaving here at this step that I need for a future step later on? And if so, we can use it as an output variable. So it's very simple, right? If the subflow is a box, what is information that we can enter in the box, and what is information that we can take out? In this generic error message, one of the things that we've done is that we have a fault message variable that you can utilize to enter in. Here's our fault message. It is a text variable, and it is available for input. So let's look at that in practice. Here is an email that sends a participant confirmation. So if it's a participant, it sends this email. If it's a spectator, it sends this email. But if an error occurs, we do want to go ahead and just, one, we roll back everything that we've done, which is a great thing to add, by the way, but we'll talk about that in the presentation about fault paths. And then we'll call our subflow. And what we do is that, you can see here, because we marked text fault message as an input variable on the generic error message screen flow, Now we can pass the information from this flow into that one in whatever method we, so that way we can give instructions to that flow into what to do. So effectively, any flow that you launch has a global variable for fault message where the information gets stored. So you can pass this information over if you'd like. And if we come back to this one, then what you can see here is that we check first to see if there's a fault message that was passed through. If there is no fault message passed through, then do nothing. But if it does have a fault message, then what we want to do is that we want to send an email to ourselves. Now I know that Salesforce can send an email. You can send an email for a variety of different reasons, but in this case, for this purpose, we're choosing to send an email, a personalized email with the fault message. And equally, we want to create a case. We want to create a log, right? So a lot of folks even create custom objects for log files. So you can log all of the flow errors that you have. And then you can report and see, hey, this is how many flow errors we're having of what type, and do we create a ticket to fix it or just to monitor, right, the success of flows. So effectively, and the irony of it is that if the error flow errors, then we have a fault message to display the error message. The full-on irony. So the idea here is that you can take action right then and there, and all of this is based on information that is inserted. If you go to debug for half a second, you'll see that even when you debug, you get to select information that you want to insert right here. So here's your text fault message. So that way you can see how all of that information will play along. Equally, if after this, let's just say, for example, that in this case, I wanted to say, hey, something went wrong, we created a case for you, right? So if on the error message that we're displaying here, we wanted to display something to the tune of, let me zoom out just slightly, say, we realized, well, lost all my font here. We realized that this is not what you were expecting. We've created a new case for you with the case number, and you can put here, well, the variable doesn't exist yet. So you could put the case number as a variable if you wanted to, and you could display that information here. Now, if by the time that this flow is done, you want to tie the case number to the record that started this, you could create a variable that says, all right, let's create text case. I mean, it could be case number or case ID, but let's just call it case number. And we'll do a case ID as well later. You can just select and select available for output. And now, once the case is created, I can just go ahead and click assign case number. And then I'll put text case number equals case. I guess I have to, I'd have to set up the variable a little bit more. But here, this would be case ID. So from here, effectively, yeah, I'm manually assign variables. So we could assign variables right here, and equally, we could, if we do it on a variable record, I'm not sure why this is not showing. Let's just use this, for example. I'm going to create a case based on a variable that we're going to call var case. So record case. So effectively, at this point, I'm creating a case based on this record variable. And then what I can do is that I can say the case number will be the same as var case number. And then if I wanted to, I could say, hey, text case ID, text, we'll mark it for output, and then we will go ahead and no default value, and then equals var case ID. So effectively now, once this flow is done, that information will be available to me. And if I want to use that information back on the original flow afterwards, I can now use that because I set that as an output value. So if you want to use a decision element to say, hey, case number, or if you want to do any actions, again, if you want to tie the original record to the case that it got created, you could do all sorts of things by leveraging Subflows this way. With that said, now we cover the basics. I mean, we should now know that Subflows are a great tool for repetition when you got to do multiple things, right? Here's one example, here's another example. And then, like if I zoom out with my computer permitting, you'll see here, this flow has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 times that I've saved myself from having to do that 12 times over on this one single flow. So we learned about the repetition. We learned about how to leverage the input and the output variables, the power of being able to submit information in as well as take information out. Now what I want to talk about is some clever different tricks about one clever trick that you can use a subflow for. And one of the key pieces that I want to go over here is simply the fact that in a flow, be it an auto-launched flow and or a be it an auto-launched flow, be it a screen flow, I don't know if record trigger flow abides by that, but I think it does. If we create a brand new flow, we start here. Anytime that this flow is going to get called, what happens, I'm just going to put test assign, and let's just quickly, just so that way there's text, hello, just call it text, input, done, just so that way there's something and I can hit save for the sake of this. New flow. Actually, for everyone here, this is everyone has their own strategy of how to label something. The way that I name flows, I encourage you guys to consider, or I encourage you guys to suggest a better one. The way that I do it is that I do the name of the object, dash, the purpose of this flow. So let's just say automation hour sharing lesson, and then the type of flow. And I always try to include a description. This is the one flow that will share everything you need to know about sharing tricks with Subflows during automation hour. So some good practices there in how we name our flows. Now, let's go ahead and look at it here in the properties. If you click and show advanced, you'll see that this typically runs blank, how to run the flow. So if you look over the help section, and it doesn't, like, I think a lot of people overlook this, but effectively, if you leave this blank, the flow typically runs with the permission that the user running has. So for example, let's just say that we're talking about a screen flow. And in the screen flow, we have to update specific fields in the case record. If the user does not have field level security permissions to edit in that case, and the flow will update that field, then what will happen is that the flow will error for insufficient privileges. You'll actually get an error if that individual tries to do it. If a system administrator runs it, they'll have access to it, the flow will work, but if you run it as an individual user, it will fail. Now, in a flow, you can select these different types, user or system context, depends how the flow is launched. You can also select access all data. And if you do access all data, you're basically enabling Yoda mode, right? Where it's do all, everything is possible. We can access all the data. From within this flow, your permissions don't matter. This flow will have access to all. Now, this isn't the perfect scenario, and you don't want to always do this. You want to be careful with this because with great power comes great responsibility, and you have to be mindful of this. So when you're giving access all data to folks, imagine, for example, if you use a screen flow that you're going to use in an experience site with guest users. You don't want to give access all data because you might be opening yourself to issues with overpowering guest users. Equally, if you're in an org that has a lot of privileges settings and a lot of org-wide defaults to private and tight sharing information, you may not want to do this for an entire flow, especially if it's a big, complicated flow like something like this, or maybe even beyond, right? In a flow like this, let's just say that the flow has to do all of this, and you don't want to give permission to all of this. So effectively, what you want to do in this scenario, imagine a scenario that this one element right here, this one lead creation, this is something that creates a lead. And you say, hey, you know what? Not everyone has the permissions to create leads. But if you're using this screen flow for this one time, if you're going to create it using this lead from this one time, what you want to do is that you want to say, hey, I want to give them permission to this. Over here, everywhere else in this flow, I want their own permissions, their own profiles and permission sets and everything to take place. But for this one step, I want them to have full authority to do it because not everybody has permission to do this. So we need to override this. What can you do? Enter subflows. Because what you can do is that you can go ahead and go in the subflow and change it right here and say, okay, the subflow will have access to all data. So for the purpose of doing what we're doing here, you could have a subflow that creates the case running as system with access all data, and equally at the same time, you can make sure that the rest of the main flow, the primary flow that launches the subflow, the rest of it still respects the user. So if the user tries to do something that they shouldn't do, that they shouldn't have access to doing, the flow still holds them accountable to that. But for the one thing that you need, if the flow runs on as system with access all data, then you can circumvent that requirement or that limitation by just granting access all data in that specific section that you need. So that is a great little permissions hack for anyone that is looking for ways to get around or better manage permissions directly in flows. So we talked about the purpose of subflows. We talked about the purpose. We talked about input and output variables. We talked about the permissions hack. Now the final one that I want to talk about is going to be. Give me 1 second for some coffee. Suspense has been building. So the final one that I want to talk about is what a subflow is not. So I get this question a lot of times, and it's come up a couple of times here. What you must remember about a subflow is that we all have limits in flows. We used to have a 2,000 element limit So you can only cycle 2,000 elements or you get an error to avoid some Apex CPU limits. That recently has gone away. However, you still have query limits. You can only query so many records. You can only update so many records. And even without the 2,000 element limit, you can still time out the CPU and get CPU limit errors if your flow becomes too convoluted. The way that all of these limits are calculated is based on what we call a transaction. So imagine a transaction being every time that you hit save from start to finish. And there's a lot of the order of operations that you might have heard about what happens when your before save flows, your after save flows, your before save code, your triggers, after save triggers, your validation rules, your workflow rules, all that stuff that's included in the order from start to finish that I have personally never remembered. I look at the ones that say before and I'm like, okay, that's before. I look at the ones that say after, and then process builders is somewhere all the way in the end, just waiting for retirement. Just waiting for retirement or to cause trouble if they're still active, which is the more realistic thing. What is important to note with a subflow that sometimes people get confused is that a subflow will not reset your transaction limits. So for example, if you have a limit of 50,000 rows that you can query, if you query 40,000 leads with this get lead record, and then you're like, well, if I query another 10,000 records or 10,001 records, I will get an error message. So let me do this. Let me just run a subflow for this 40,000 or the main flow for this 40,000, a subflow for another 20, and then another subflow for another 20. That doesn't work. That will not work, and that will still error because the transactions do not get reset when you run a subflow. So that's just something that I want you guys to keep in mind because it's not a savior that way. There are some clever tricks that we can do, and the name of that flow is called the platform event flow, and that will be a whole new separate transaction. And I have done a couple of presentations or a little bit of work with Paul McCullum. There's a couple of folks, a couple of trailblazers that are really good, where we found ways to do millions of records with flows. So, which is a whole separate conversation for a whole separate time. And you guys can research Paul McCullum and platform event flows. He's got a ton of materials. I think he's been also in Automation Hour. So there's probably an Automation Hour session on how to do this as well. But for the sake of a subflow will not reset your transaction limits. So in a quick recap, let's quickly go back to this one. We talked about this, the key items that we want to go over. We talked about the fact that subflows are intended for repetition, input variables and output variables. We talked about the permission hack, basically being able to use subflows with access all data. So you grant access all data access in the key pieces of the subflow that will make the biggest difference for you. Then, and finally, the biggest piece that we talked about, now we're aware of what subflows are not, right? Be aware of those transaction levels. Running subflows will not reset your transaction levels, so you have to be mindful when you're building flows, especially if you're querying a lot of data, if you're updating a lot of data, things that you have to be mindful when you're running. Those transaction limits still have to be abided by and respected. Otherwise, Salesforce will look at you and say no. And then as a quick recap, right, like again, final, great for repetitive tasks. I love subflows. I can't tell you enough about how much use I have for subflows. And in the way that I design flows, I always start in my head to say, will this be used anywhere else? Can I make this into a subflow? Can I repurpose this, whatever it is that I'm building later in the future? With an error message, you will be able to own your handling experience for your end users, create something that looks a little bit cooler, create something that logs which flow errors are occurring and when, with what user, with what record, so you can become better at troubleshooting these, and you can be more proactive about troubleshooting these and understanding how good the flows that you're building are and monitoring how many errors or how many poor experiences ultimately your end users are experiencing. And then also, if you've been with me, my webcam decided to not work or just decided to point further down than it should. But if you're still with me, you've hopefully enjoyed a tasty beverage. So thank you very much. I would love to have questions and conversations. I'm not sure if it's something that we can do here. I will, I'll ask Rakesh to help me moderate this piece. And,
right.
But equally, thank you all for being a part of this.
Thank you, Rick. This was very, very helpful session for me as well. So now the first question is, what kind of camera or app you using that tracking your movements?
Yeah, I know, right? It's a great example because I actually really like this camera. It's called the InstaLink 360, and there's like a double tap functionality that allows me to have the tracking motion. There. Oh, now it's back. There we go. So now I can come and I can show, and I can walk you guys through everything here if I'd like, and then I can come back here. It's called the InstaLink 360, and then you can also do like zoom in, like there's like zoom in commands. So I can be like here, and if I do aha, and then like this, and something like that. But yeah, it's kind of neat. So I'm still learning.
Very good. All right. Next question is, sorry. All right. Next question is there a reason to not use input or outputs?
So look, I'm sure that there's a use case or two. It's tough to launch I mean, if the subflow that you want to launch has zero dependency on the flow that it's being called from, then maybe you have an argument where you don't need input variables. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's a use case. It's not very common, but it's there. And then output variables, it's more, at least in my experience, it's more common that you won't use them. The error message is a great example, like at least how the error handling message, we're just displaying an error message. We don't, after we display that to them, there's nothing that the original flow needs to do because something errored and you don't want to continue on that flow. So there's no need for an output variable there. It really depends on the use case, right? So could it happen? Sure. Can't think of an example right now, but yeah, it could.
Awesome. Next question is, how do you keep track of or find all the places that your subflows are referenced?
That is a great question. So the way that I do it right now, and that goes back to what I was talking about in my naming convention. So if it's something that I'm building that is going to be specifically a subflow, at the end, instead of Autolaunched, I'll use subflow. And at least right now, what I do is that I go on the list view of on flows, and I'll create list views for subflows, and I'll put like contains subflow. So that way I can way I can easily find all of my subflows. Where they're referenced, I'll be honest, the easiest thing that I can do is just try to delete them, knowing that they won't be deleted, just because like, or I'll do this in a sandbox, for the love of God, for the dear love of God, do this in a sandbox. But if you delete them, it'll tell you where they're referenced. So that's how I do it. I'm sure that there's a trick out there of like a better way of handling this, but at least for me, that's how I've grown accustomed to doing it.
Awesome. Next question is, for example, allowing low permissions user to create leads via screen flow, you would replace the create lead element with a subflow that can create lead that run in system context.
So that was just a random example. I just picked an element at random. The things that you have to keep in consideration is what is it that you need that needs to be in the access all data subflow. So for example, if you're going to collect information or if you're going to try to assign values to something that the user has no access to, like even before the create element, the assignment or the reference to fields that they may not have access to has to be taken into consideration. So if you're going to assign a value to a field that they don't have access to, that has to happen inside the access all data subflow, because otherwise they don't get a chance to, like that errors, because it's trying to say, hey, yeah, update, lead custom field 2. Yeah, but user doesn't have field level security into that. You want to do that in the subflow along with the create lead, right? So that's in that particular scenario, that's the one thing you have to be mindful of. So keep in mind everything that that every step in your flow that requires access all data, so you can include that into the subflow.
Awesome. Brandon is asking, Apex Trigger use a one trigger per object model. Is that true with flow, where you should use a single flow, and would a best practice by using Subflow to launch those processes?
Ooh, I like that question. And I know a lot of us get to ask that question. Here's where so before Flow Orchestrator, before all of these new tools that we've had in the last 3 or 4 releases, I was very much in a no more than 2 flows per object. One for before save, the second one for after save. You can have one before save, one after save, handle everything within that flow, and that's that. With the improvements in the start element with the Flow Orchestrator, I'm still of the opinion of one flow, like only one flow should fire at a time. Only one before save flow and one after save flow should fire at a time. That's at least my internal guideline. How I manage that today is with start elements. So for example, at First Advantage, we heavily rely on cases. So we have specific flows that have start elements that are tied to the record types that they've served. So we have an after save flow that's specific to this record type. We have an after save flow that's specific to that record type. That way, we're always trying to ensure that you don't fire multiple flows on the same transaction. So that's how, so now we have multiple after save flows on cases, but we're still trying to control on the start element, to make sure to say, hey, no 2 flows will fire at the same time.
Awesome.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Last question, are subflows similar to the idea of writing a function in programming language?
So I'll just answer you with this. I've never written a single line of code that made it to a production environment, and that's a good thing. So if there's any developers here that want to answer that question, sure, I am the last person you'd want to answer that question. I would not take my word on anything, on any comparisons to development or coding.
I will answer, yes, it is the same thing. So you are writing a function and reusable class that can be called anywhere else, so that you don't have to write the same logic 5 different times. All right.
Thank you, Rakesh.
You're welcome. And next one, sir. In your flow that fire based on record type, do you need to hard code the record type ID into the start element?
Ooh, that's another good question as well. So you would be forgiven for thinking that you have to. The challenge with hard coding IDs, as many of the listeners may already know, is that there could be a mismatch between the ID for a record type in production, or any type of ID really, but ID for a record type in production and the ID for the record type in sandbox, especially if they're recently refreshed, or if they have the sandbox hasn't been recently refreshed. So the challenge there is that how do you build something that is a little more scalable? If you're going to use the default UI on the start elements, then you have to, what I do is that I use custom labels. So I will create a custom label for the record type ID, and then I will reference saying record type ID equals custom label record type ID case 123, whatever it is. So that way, when I deploy, I can deploy the change set with the flow and the custom label, and then all I have to do is that I just have to change the value in the custom label. So that way the custom label holds the ID that I want, and it's much easier to manage. And I like to manage mine with custom labels. I know some folks do it with, I believe, custom settings, which is a little bit different, which I think works just as well. But the second method that I've heard that a lot of people are using is that now in the start elements, I think 1 or 2 releases ago, you can do start elements that are based on formulas. And in the formulas, I believe that you can climb up the ladder. So you can go record, record type ID, and record type developer name. So you could pull that and in a formula say, yeah, if record dot record type ID dot the developer name equals this, then start the flow. And you can do it with a formula based start criteria as well. I'm old school. I like my custom labels, so I'm still doing it, but I think there are a couple of other maybe faster ways of doing that now.
Awesome. Pat is asking, flow are not in my wheelhouse. What is the best resource to learn basics for flows?
I'll give you the answer, but you have to sign up to FlowFest first. Now, so there's so many awesome resources out there. I've put together Trailhead or trail mixes. I put together trail mixes for my team at First Advantage, and I had to do all of them because I wanted to make sure that the work was good for my team. I know Trailhead has some decent trail mixes that have decent start points. I know a lot of folks that have flow courses that are just awesome at what they do. I mean, Andy Yudkin, Daryl Moon. There's a lot of blogs that have a lot of really good information as well, like Yumi Brahimzad for Salesforce Time. Salesforce Ben has a lot of good content. Go back and watch like the last 3 seasons of Automation Hour. There's a lot of good stuff, but if you haven't done anything yet, I think a lot of the folks like again, like Andy Yudkin and Daryl Moon have some courses. There's a lot of other folks that offer also some flow starter courses that are like 3 hours worth of video, and they take their time, like it's video, right? So you can rewatch things, you can take your time and do your things and go from there. That would probably be a great starting point.
Agreed. Next questions. For transactions limit, how to handle them in the best way?
Avoid them. So the way that I teach, and I told, because we do Flow Fridays at First Advantage, where we get together and we train our team on flows. If anyone from First Advantage is here right now, if anyone on my team is here right now, they'll know where I'm coming from. I say this: my rule of thumb is try to avoid as much pink as possible, right? The pink elements are the ones you want to avoid. So avoid using too many get elements, avoid using too many update elements or too many create elements. Especially now, Flow is so powerful. Like before, you could say, oh yeah, I want to get all of my open leads, and I want to get all of my converted leads, and I want to get all of my this. Just get the leads, do one get leads that has everything that you need, and use filter elements to filter what you need. So that way you're reusing and repurposing that one get element, right? And then equally, if you're like, oh yeah, create all the leads for this and create all the leads for that, consolidate, right? Create collections, use collections, try to spare yourself from having to run too much DML, which are the creates and the updates. Try to lean yourself out that way. If you're getting too advanced and you're saying, you know, yeah, I handle too much data, I can't get around this, I would say realistically try to use platform events. So there's a lot of good content on platform events to break down transactions. I think that would be a great thing to consider as well.
All right, next question. After updating a flow and saving it as a new version, my active button is grayed out. How can I activate my new version?
That could be a variety of different reasons. Typically, they tell you why. If a flow is not being allowed to activate, and you know, for those who can hear my dog in the background, he's saving us from the Amazon driver. So Usually there's a reason. Usually there's a reason why you can't activate. You're missing something, or you're doing something that the flow doesn't like. I mean, it could be a variety of things. It's tough to give you a direct answer on this. So yeah, I'm happy to ping me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to take a look at it. But off the top of my head like this, it could be a variety of things.
Awesome. Last questions. Good or bad practice to use a subflow to handle all your gets upfront and another subflow to handle all your update at the end, and then just pass records in and out of subflow along the way?
So that's a great question. Going back to the conversation we were having earlier. So you have to be mindful that subflows will not reset your transaction limits. So thinking that you're going to lean out your flow and make it more flexible to transaction limits by just doing subflows instead, that's not a good use case for subflows. You can try to do it, but it's not going to do you any favors. And at that point, again, the real strength of subflows is repetition. So unless you're using that in multiple different places, then it's just going to end up costing you more time to maintain multiple flows. So yeah, for transaction purposes and to be able to get more or update more, it's typically not a good practice.
All right, I think that's pretty much everything. Eric, any final thought?
Nah, I mean, I always enjoy being part of these. I enjoy having these conversations. I love the questions. I love the engagement. If you guys have more questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. If I'm too busy or whatever, I'll at least try to point you in the right direction. I was promotional pitch here again, FlowFest, check it out. We had a great time last week, or this week. Oof, time's flying. Yeah. So overall, glad to be here, very humbled to be here and get to present again, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate all you do for Ohana and Salesforce community, Eric.
Sounds good. Likewise, Rakesh. Likewise to you. You and Michelle are one of the best in the Ohana. So glad to. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. I will post the recording as soon as it get ready on our Automation Hour YouTube channel. So thank you and have a nice weekend.